my fellow wizards! With the release of the recent Darkmoor update, Shadow Magic got some major changes, with one of the biggest being the inclusion of a new mechanic, Shadow Pacts, that affect almost every single shadow spell in the game. I've heard from a number of players that they find this new system a bit confusing to navigate, so today I'm here with this guide that explains how Shadow Pacts work and the easiest ways to use them so you can harness the full power of Shadow Magic without taking too much damage in the process. To begin, let's talk about what Shadow Pacts are and how they work. For those not aware, when casting a shadow spell, you will now make a pact or contract with a shadow creature to give you the power to cast the spell in exchange for either hanging effects or your health. You will also still need a shadow pip to cast the spell. So what does that mean? When casting a shadow spell, the shadow creature related to that spell will indicate a specific type of hanging effect that it wants. These can be everything from charms, weaknesses, shields, and traps to healovertime and damageovertime effects. You'll be able to tell what hanging effect the creature wants from this new symbol on each spell card, as well as a scroll that appears in the fight itself with the symbol of the hanging effect it wants on it. So in this example, you can see a scroll appear on the enemy showing a weakness symbol. So for this Shadow Pact, the creature wants weaknesses on the enemy. Each Shadow Pact will consume or remove one hanging effect each round for 3 rounds after you cast your shadow spell, and if the hanging effect is unavailable, the creature will grow in size behind you, signaling that you failed to fulfill the pact for that round. Some pacts require hanging effects that you place on yourself or the enemy, while others require hanging effects that the enemy places on you or themselves. On the 3rd round, the shadow creature will take 5% of your health for each round the pact wasn't fulfilled and the creature grew in size for a maximum of 15% health lost. If, however, you fulfilled the pact every round and the 3 hanging effects were consumed, you won't take any damage from the shadow creature, so you need to either have those hanging effects available or take that health damage. If, however, the combat ends early before the 3 rounds are up to trade over those hanging effects, you will still have to pay with your health, even if you kill the enemy, so there's no way out of paying the price of the Shadow Pact one way or another. In addition, if the pact is replaced with another pact, like if you cast a second shadow spell, you will also have to pay with your health. So for example, the new shadow version of Glowbug Squall will have a pact that requires 3 damage over time effects on your wizard be consumed in order to not take any damage from the shadow creature. For people wondering, even if you have no hanging effects available to give the shadow creature what it wants, you can still cast your shadow spells as normal, you just will take that 15% health loss as payment for the shadow magic instead. Okay, so that's the basic concept for Shadow Pacts. However, on top of that, many of the new versions of shadow spells are now created through spell fusions. So most of the original shadow spells you guys are probably familiar with are now getting a base, non-shadow version of the spell, and a new shadow-enhanced version that you use by fusing the new base spell with one of the new shadow creature spells. So for example, if you want to use the new shadow version of Rusalka's Wrath, you would need to combine the new basic non-shadow version of Rusalka with the Dark Shrike spell to create Rusalka's Flood, the shadow-enhanced version of the spell. For people who have experimented with spell weaving, spell fusions probably aren't anything new to you, but for other players, this may be a novel concept. So to fuse your new shadow spells, you need to have something called a fusion formula, which is basically just like a recipe for combining 2 spells together. You can train the fusion formula for your shadow spells from the new shadow creature trainers located in the Eclipse Tower in the Moon Cliffs of Chrysalis. Here you can also follow a tutorial given by Sophia Darkside, who also explains Shadow Pacts, and you can train the new shadow transformation spells from her, which also use Shadow Pacts. If you check the fusion formula section of your deck, you can see what 2 spells you need to fuse to make your new shadow spells. Then you need to head over to Elena Darksun in the Solar Arc of Conda Desert in Chrysalis to train the shadow creature spell for your school. So in Storm's case, for instance, it's Dark Shrike. So I can now check my fusion formula and see that if I want to fuse my new shadow spell, Glowbugs, I need to pack in my deck regular old Glowbugs and that Dark Shrike spell. Then, once I'm in a fight, I can click on one of those spells and then the other while both spells are in my hand to fuse them together and make my shiny new shadow spell, Glowbugs. Another quick tip is to make sure you enchant your shadow spell after fusing it, because if I were to simply enchant regular basic glow bugs before fusing it, it would not work. So fuse, then enchant your shadow spells. And I can then see right on the spell description what the shadow pact is for glow bugs. It's damage over time effects on the caster. So once I cast the spell, I know that I need to either have 3 damage over time effects on me for the shadow creature to consume, or I'll take up to 15% health damage. So hopefully you now know what shadow pacts are and how to fuse your shadow spells, but if you're still confused about what any individual shadow spells do, I definitely recommend checking out my other in-depth video on the topic. So next up, let's take a look at all the different types of shadow pacts and the best ways to use them. As mentioned earlier, there are different types of shadow pacts, with some requiring hanging effects on the caster and some requiring hanging effects on the enemy. The current shadow pacts can include charms, weaknesses, shields, traps, healovertimes, and damageovertimes on either you, the caster, or the enemy you're targeting. No matter which type of hanging effect the shadow creature wants, you will always need 3 of them available over 3 rounds in order to take no damage from the shadow creature. So if the shadow pact requires charms on the caster, you will need to be prepared to offer up 3 charms over 3 rounds for the shadow creature to consume, or you'll take damage instead. So this guide is intended to show you the easiest ways to set up these packs, ideally in only one turn right before you use your shadow spell, so you can use your shadow spells with as little hassle as possible and not lose any health. So I'll primarily be focusing on spells that give 3 or more hanging effects in one turn. The obvious downside here is that if you win the fight using your shadow hits, you will automatically lose that 15% health no matter what, because if the fight ends, the shadow creature won't have the 3 rounds needed after hitting to consume all the hanging effects for the pact. So I'm very much hoping the devs change this, because it essentially punishes players for finishing fights with shadow spells. I'd much prefer that if a player finishes a fight by hitting and defeating the enemy with a shadow spell, that the shadow creature simply takes any available hanging effects at the end of the fight in one go and then calculates any health loss for the player. Another downside to this system is that certain shadow pact requirements are very difficult for players to set up because they rely on the enemy casting certain spells that you have little to no control over. For instance, pacts that require weaknesses or damage over time effects on the caster or heal over time effects on the enemy can be really hard to influence in any meaningful way because you can't always predict what the enemy will cast on themselves or on you. The only thing you can do is guess what kind of spells a creature may cast, either by checking the wiki for the spells they have, or knowing that, for instance, a life enemy is likely to cast heal over times, or a fire enemy is likely to cast damage over times. So for some of these packs, there's just not much you as the player can do or cast to fulfill those packs, which can be frustrating. But there are definitely a bunch of spells you can cast to fulfill a bunch of different shadow packs, so let's talk about all your options. First up are shadow packs that require charms on the caster, which includes Abyssal Worm, Kisma's Wrath, Grim Grenadier, Wings of Night, and Shadow Seraph, Shrike, and Trickster. Thankfully, there are a number of utility spells that give you 3 charms in one go. These include the Elemental and Spirit Blades, the Moon, Star, and Sun Blades, Elemental and Spirit Spears, and the Triple School Blades from the Skella Warrior pets. Of these, Elemental and Spirit Blades are probably your best option since most schools train at least one of these anyway from Niles and Krakatopia. You can also just buy the treasure card version for gold from Harold Argleston and other TC vendors. With all of these, it can be smart to actually use whatever blades do not include your native schools to avoid accidentally using them up when hitting. So for example, if I'm a storm, I could use the spirit blades because there's no risk of my storm spells using up any of those blades for a hit. So they'll instead be kept safe to be consumed by the shadow creature to fulfill that pact. Then the item cards for the Moon, Star, and Sun Blades can mainly be found on the Atavistic/Bygone level 60 wands, the Florimancer amulets and hats, and the Fairy Key amulets and hats. The Elemental and Spirit Spears can be trained from Enya Firemoon in the Wild and Avalon, and the TC bought for gold from Librarian Fitzhume in the Arcanum and other TC vendors. Then finally, there's the Triple Blades from the Life, Storm, and Death Skella Warrior pets. And as an honorable mention, I do want to include the dual spell weaving blades for most schools from weaving into Balance, Storm, or Life, since those offer 2 blades and you can just stack a 3rd blade on top of them to make 3 for the pact, though obviously that takes more setup. And if you want more info on spell weaving in general, you can check out my other videos. Moving on from the utility spells, we can look at attack spells with potential secondary effects that give 3 or more charms. Life has a bunch of options, including the new base Lamassu and Centaur, which gives blades for clearing traps on the caster. And then if you dip into spell weaving, Life Wizards can also learn Coolest Centaur, Forest Fire, and Centaurian. Balance then gets the new base Gaze of Fate and Terminus' Strike, where you can either trade traps on the enemy for blades or echo up to 7 blades on the target. Death then has Gravestorm, the new base Snack Attack, Skeletal Dragon with up to a whopping 7 blades for clearing charms from the enemy, and the fire weaving spell Pyre Dragon. Finally, Storm gets Hecate's Strike, which is actually another fusion spell you can train from Torrents and Ravenwood. And then for weaving into Death and Myth, Storm can also learn Grimzilla and Mythic Mermaids. For all schools, one of your best options here is definitely Centaur, because if you aren't a Life Wizard and don't want to train it, you can also pretty easily buy the treasure card for Path B from the Bazaar, whereas other spells here you might have to train outright to use. I do want to add that you can always pick any spell that gives 1 to 2 blades, not just the ones listed here, and then stack another single or double blade on top, though that costs extra turns. Shifting over to pacts that require healovertime effects on the caster, we have Nested Darkness, Night Raid, Tenebrous Trebuchet, Shadow Sultan, and Shade of Musicology. Schools that can apply 3 healovertime effects in 1 turn include Life, Storm, and Fire. Life has Toweret's Touch, which is a fusion spell that can be trained from Blossom in Ravenwood, Phoebus' Will and Life King Artorias that gambit damage over time effects on the enemy for heal over times, and finally Gnomes, which is kind of a weird choice in that it trades heal over times on the caster for potentially better heal over times. That might not be your first pick on this list, but it does technically fit the requirement. Now, some people may be wondering where the heck Rebirth is, since that previously applied 3 heal over time effects. Unfortunately, in the most recent update, it got nerfed down to just 2 heal over time effects, so it no longer makes the cut for this list. We then have Storm, who gets Tree of Strife, which has actually been buffed to now apply 3 heal over time effects instead of just 2 by trading charms. Then there's the new base, Dark and Stormy, and Storm King Artorias. Finally, Phoenix was also tweaked this update to now apply up to 3 heal over time effects instead of just 1 scaled heal over time effect. If you want to grab just the treasure card versions of these spells to use without needing to use up training points, I think Phoenix is probably the easiest to snag from the Bazaar. Finally, you can also take any spell that applies 2 heal over time effects and then throw on a sprite after you hit with the shadow spell, but that obviously uses multiple turns for setup compared to just 1. Moving on, we have all the shadow spell packs that require shields on the caster, which includes Eldritch Checkmate, Dark Hunger, Grim Irredeemer, Tatzelworm Horror, Dark Trickster, and Shadow Sentinel. Thankfully, there are a bunch of utility spells that give you 3 shields in one go. The obvious ones are, of course, Elemental and Spirit Shield, which unfortunately can only be learned outright by Balance Wizards, but thankfully you can find the treasure card versions fairly easily from various TC vendors like Librarian Fitzhume in the Arcanum. Then there's Moon, Star, and Sun Shields, which are mainly found on Fairy Key Amulets and Boots, the Liches and Legends wands, and some Atavistic and Bygone level 60 wands. Finally, the various school wall item cards are mainly found on Highland gear from the Unforgiven Horde pack and level 150 Demiurge crafted gear from Lemuria. Another honorable mention I want to include are the 0-pip double shields every school besides Balance gets, since you can always place those down and then stack another single or double shield on top of it to get at least 3 shields, but obviously that requires more setup. Now we can check out all the attack spells with secondary effects that apply 3 or more shields on the caster. Up first is Ice with a ton of options, including the new base Abominable Weaver, Frostbite, Blighthound, which got some pretty major tweaks to Path B this update, the new base Snowball Barrage, Ice King Artorias, the Hierophant, and if you do some balance weaving, Evil Sandman. Myth then gets Improbable Gaze and Basilisk, whose bombs got changed into regular damage over time effects this update. Next is Death with Woebegone Frenzy, Pluto's Peril, and Death King Artorias. Life gets 1 option if you weave into Ice, Taiga King, and finally Balance gets Elemental Golem, Hydra, Sabretooth, and the ice weaving spell Refrigeration. Of these, your easiest options if you don't want to train these spells are probably Blighthound, Elemental Golem, Hydra, and Sabretooth, since you can fairly easily find those treasure cards at the Bazaar. Now we can take a look at spell packs that require weaknesses, damage over time effects, and traps on the caster. These include Evil Freeze Ray, Snow No Mercy, Serpent Beguiler, and Dark Nova for weaknesses, Reverse World, Gloam Bugs, and Dark Shrike for damage over time effects, and lastly, Delphic Lamassu, Moody Caterpillar, Bale Barbarian, and Dark Seraph for traps. I'm grouping these all together because they require the enemy to cast spells on you, which can be very difficult to predict or control. For weaknesses and damage over time effects, you kind of just have to predict whether or not an enemy is likely to cast these spells on you, especially if they're Death or Fire School, for example. However, for traps, we can at least do a little bit to influence the outcome. First up, we have our good old reliable Feint, whose main downside can actually help us in this instance. Feint applies a trap on the enemy and a 30% trap on the caster, which can technically be used to fulfill the 3 traps required for the Shadow Pact. Obviously, you have to hope the enemy doesn't immediately just hit you afterward and remove the trap, but hey, it's something. Then we can also use Trap Dilution, which clears up to 4 traps on the caster to instead apply up to 4 diluted traps that are 20% damage each. So how does this help us? Because to use this spell, you obviously already need to have traps on you. Well, if an enemy is trap stacking you and you're still gearing up to hit, but are worried that in the meantime the enemy may hit you and use up all those traps in one go, this spell turns them all into 20% traps that are no longer stackable. So if the enemy hits you while you're preparing your shadow spell, they'll only remove one 20% trap at a time instead of a whole bunch of traps if they were stackable. So this is definitely kind of a niche use spell, but I figured it was still worth including here. Feint TC can be found at the bazaar fairly regularly, and item cards are on various pacts and amulets that can be bought for gold, like Jewel of the Feint, although I really do recommend all players just train Feint outright. Then Trap Dilution can be trained from Balance Professors, and the item card versions are mainly found on the Jester amulets and a few Gorgon decks. Now we can swap over to Shadow Pacts that require hanging effects to be placed on the enemy you're targeting. First, we have the spells requiring weaknesses on the target, which includes Reverse Fortune, Dark Age, Fear of the Dark, Rusalka's Flood, and Shadow Shepherd. There's only 3 main utility spells that apply 3 weaknesses in one go: Elemental and Spirit Weakness, and Threefold Fever. Elemental and Spirit Weakness can be trained from Niles and Krokotopia. Unfortunately, I don't believe there are any TC or item card versions currently available, so you will likely have to train these spells outright. Then for Threefold Fever, you can train the spell from Mortis and Nightside, but any TC can only be crafted by being part of a guild. Otherwise, the item card version is available on certain pets, the Amulet of Divine Influence, and some Hun-Hao decks from the Crying Sky raid. So for these options, you may be best off just training one of these spells outright if you have the training points available. Now let's take a look at all the attack spells that can apply up to 3 weaknesses as a secondary effect. Ice and Death spells are clearly the stars of the show here, with 6 and 7 different options respectively. Ice gets Deathly Depths, the new base Shatterhorn, Woe of Shu, which is a fusion that can be trained from Kelvin in Ravenwood, Snow Angel, Woolly Mammoth, and if you weave into Death, Primal Stampede. Balance then gets Obsidian Colossus, which has a new Path C this update, Terminus' Strike, and Balance King Artorias. Next, Death has Lord of Night, Wraith, and the new base Grim Reader and Wicked Sorrow, Scarecrow, Dr. Von's Monster, and if you weave into Life, Greenblight. Finally, Storm gets a single option if you weave into Life called Green Serpent. Of these, your easiest options if you don't want to train the spells are probably Scarecrow, Wraith, Dr. Von's Monster, Snow Angel, and Woolly Mammoth, who are most likely to have TC available at the bazaar. Besides the options listed here, you can also take any spell that applies 2 weaknesses and then throw on a single school weakness or something like Infection after you hit with a shadow spell, but that obviously uses multiple turns for setup compared to just 1. Alright, now let's shift over to the Shadow Pacts that require damage over time effects on the target, such as Boxenspiel, Lords of the Wilds, and Hex House. Obviously, Fire is going to give you the most options, with 7 spells that give you 3 damage over time effects in one go. We have Immolate, Amit's Fury, which is a fusion that can be trained from Bernie in Ravenwood, Ifrit, Fires of Mars, Rain of Fire, Caldera Djinn, and if you weave into Myth, Bardic Elf. Then Life gets a few options with Forest Lord and Spinosaur with various bomb effects. Storm's weaving into Fire can get Boiling Kraken, Balance gets Chimera, Ice Wizards weaving into Fire get Evil Magma Man, and finally Myth gets the fusion spell Lamort Thoth, which can be trained from Ivan in Ravenwood and was recently updated to use regular damage over time effects rather than the original bombs. Of these, your best options if you don't want to train any spells are probably Forest Lord, Spinosaur, Ifrit, Rain of Fire, and Chimera, who have TC you can buy at the bazaar pretty regularly. Shifting over to Shadow Pacts that require traps on the target, there's Shadow of Fate, Reverse Chariot, Wicked Bull, Dark Weaver, Shadowhorn, Shadow Fiend, and Shadow Nova. Thankfully, there are a number of utility spells to help you out. We've got elemental and spirit traps, moon, sun, and star traps, and the various school fuel options. Elemental and spirit traps can be trained from Niles and Krakatopia and are probably your best options here because they can also be bought for gold from TC vendors like Harold Argleston. Meanwhile, the moon, sun, and star trap item cards can mainly be found on the level 60 Atavistic and Bygone wands and fairy key amulets and robes. Finally, only fire wizards learn fuel outright, but fuel treasure cards do drop from other enemies and can also be harvested from mistletoe, purple, red, and yellow bell peppers. Then these school fuel item cards can mainly be found on various pieces from the Road Warriors pack and several pets like the new School Skella Warriors from Aquila. Most of the school fuel treasure cards similarly drop from the Road Warriors pack. As an honorable mention, I also want to add the double traps that can be trained by spell weaving, since you can always place those down and then add a single trap on top to make 3 traps, though obviously that takes extra rounds to set up. Now let's check out all the attack spells that can apply up to 3 traps as a secondary effect. There's a ton of options here, so many that I've had to make multiple slides to show them all. So first up we have Ice and Fire. Ice gets Ice Wyvern, Count Crocula, Colossus, Shoe, Mark of Shoe, which is a fusion spell that can be trained from Kelvin in Ravenwood, Frost Giant, Neptune's Fury, and the weaving spells Rockman of Ages and Mountain Man. Then for Fire you can get Nap the Scarab, Glimpse of Infinity, the new base S'more Machine, Amit's Rage, which is yet another fusion spell that can be trained from Bernie in Ravenwood, and if you weave into Balance, Balaphant. Then we get a whole bunch of options for myth spells. There's Ninja Pigs, Minotaur, the new base Tasselworn Terror, the fusion spell Thothic Twist, trained from Ivan in Ravenwood, Saturn's Reaping, Medusa, Myth King Artorias, and the weaving spells Desert Minotaur and Blizzitar. Finally, Balance and Death each get their own weaving option with Mind Blown and Grave Chill. Of these options, your easiest choices are probably Ice Wyvern, Colossus, Frost Giant, Minotaur, and Medusa, since they are most likely to have TC versions at the bazaar. However, you can also always just use spells that give you 1 or 2 traps and apply one of your single or double traps on top of it, but again, that costs more rounds to set up. Last, we can take a look at spell packs that require charms, healovertime effects, and shields on the target. These include Sorrow's Shadow, Reverse Hierophant, and Dark Sentinel for charms, From Beyond, Reverse Mortality, Reverse Tower, and Dark Shepherd for healovertimes, and Into Darkness, Shade Scimitars, Curse Colossus, Reverse Emperor, and Dark Fiend for shields. Just like the previous section with weaknesses, traps, and damage overtime effects on the caster, I'm grouping these all together because they require the enemy to cast spells on themselves, which can be very difficult to predict or control. For shields and healovertime effects, you kind of just have to predict whether or not an enemy is likely to cast these types of spells on themselves, especially if they're ice or life school, for example. However, for the charms, we can at least do a little bit to influence the outcome. Just like Trap Dilution, there's also another spell called Blade Dilution that clears up to 4 charms from the enemy to instead apply up to 4 15% damage blades on the enemy. So how does this help us? Because to use the spell, you obviously already need the enemy to have placed blades on themselves. If an enemy is blade stacking themselves and you're still gearing up to hit but are worried that in the meantime the enemy may hit you and use up all those blades in one go, this spell turns them all into 15% blades that are no longer stackable. So if the enemy hits you while you're preparing your shadow spell, they'll only be able to use one 15% blade at a time instead of a whole bunch of blades if they were still stackable, allowing you to potentially swoop in with your shadow spell and use some of those 15% blades to fulfill your shadow pact. So this is another fairly niche use spell, but I figured I would include it anyway. Blade Dilution can be trained from Balance Professors, and the item cards are mainly found on the Jester Amulets and a few of the Gorgon decks. Alright my fellow wizards, that was my guide on all the currently available shadow packs, how they work, and what spells you can use to best fulfill them and not take any health damage. Definitely let me know in the comments what your favorite combos are for the various shadow packs, or if you'd rather just eat that 15% health cost. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, as it really does help me to make more amazing Wiz content for you all. And if you want to support me and the channel further, you can hit the join button below to become one of my awesome channel members. As always, I hope to see you out there in the spiral, and happy questing!